Steel and aluminium are Trump's latest targets. President Trump plans a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminium imports, due to kick in tomorrow or Wednesday. It's a ratcheting up of tension with neighbours Canada and Mexico, who, along with Brazil, are the biggest steel importers to the US. Vicky Pryce is Chief Economic Advisor to the CEBR. Vicky, what do you make of metals being picked as a target here?
Well, it's happened before, so it's not new. It happened in 2018 when Trump imposed tariffs on EU imports and actually wider as well, but on EU imports of about 25%, if I recall, on aluminium and 10% on steel. And those, of course, were hotly disputed at the time. They stayed for a bit, but just before he actually went from being president, they were being negotiated down and they disappeared under Biden. So we're back there again, really, and that's a concern. Now, this time, one doesn't know whether it's for real or whether it is there just to get some concessions from the Europeans in particular, but also, of course, from China. And that's a big issue, I think, which leaves us with a lot of uncertainty ahead as to what the impact of those tariffs might, in fact, be in the short to medium term.
So what impact could that have then, Vicky, if these go ahead, not only on foreign trade, of course, but on prices for the US manufacturers who are buying foreign steel?
Well, a huge amount of steel is imported in the US, although President Trump seemed to think that they can produce it all themselves. In reality, there are all sorts of different types of steel which are absolutely needed and where the US doesn't have necessarily any strength. And that's what's been going on and why, so much is now dependent on imports from China, for example, but also the EU. The costs to businesses in the US are inevitably going to be going up if those tariffs indeed are imposed and stay at that level. But I would imagine, like before, that the business community in the US is going to be lobbying pretty hard to see those either not imposed or, if they are, to just not last for very long, because we also know that President Trump uses those tariffs to get different types of concessions from various countries. And it probably is looking particularly at the EU maybe importing more goods and reducing some of the tariffs it imposes on, let's say, car imports from the US, where the tariff is very high by comparison to what the US charges on car imports from Europe.
What about the risk, though, Vicky, not of negotiation, but of escalation of retaliatory tariffs from China and the EU on US products? What form could that take?
Yeah, the Chinese have already been hinting that they would retaliate again. I mean, they have already, because they have imposed that 10 to 15% tariff on a number of goods coming from the US, and they could do more. And that could be obviously of concern to the US. But the reality is that there is a big deficit that the US has with China. So the cost will be mainly borne by the US if there are more retaliations. So it isn't really a huge issue for China, which doesn't really import huge amounts from the US. The real problem is whether we end up with a serious trade war, which of course means lower growth across the world. And you've already seen in the US that because of the sort of uncertainty, if you like, about what the tariff increases already announced at the time would mean for inflation, that the Federal Reserve didn't reduce interest rates, which otherwise it would have done.
Canada and Mexico, of course, are key steel suppliers, and they're still facing a deadline of the 1st of March for tariffs on all their products as threatened by President Trump. What consequences could that have?
That could quite clearly affect quite considerably, first of all, growth in those countries, but also more particularly what happens in the US, because, yes, one of the reasons why there's been this postponement has been because of political concessions that both Canada and Mexico made, particularly in terms of patrolling the border more effectively than had been the case before, both in terms of immigration, but also in terms of drugs, which could cross the border and have been crossing the borders quite easily, particularly from Mexico up to the States. But the cost to the US is going to be quite significant because, of course, something like half of all the imports in the car industry in the US come from those two countries, Canada and Mexico. So the negative impact will really be felt in the US quite significantly.
That was Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor to the CEBR. And don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.